Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, comrades, patrons. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 41. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. So today, I would like to speak on a topical issue, which is the military coup d'etat in Guinea, which occurred on Sunday. But I'd like to speak about this military takeover in a broader sense, in terms of trying to suggest a framework which gives us a better understanding of these military takeovers in African countries, rather than just treat it as a coup d'etat that is unique to Guinea. Let's look at the multiple coups that have occurred in African countries since September 1960, when Patrice Lumumba, the Pan-African Nationalist Prime Minister of Congo, was overthrown in the CIA and Belgian and British sponsored coup d'etat, and of course subsequently murdered, and dictator Mobutu installed in power for 37 years by the West. So I want to look at it in a broader sense so we can also gain an understanding why we've seen a series of recent coups, primarily in West Africa and in Central Africa, beginning with Mali last year in August, and then early this year in Chad, in Mali again, and then finally in Guinea. So I want to show how in all these cases the state is very weak and how it is relatively very easy to carry out these military takeovers. So I want to discuss that. And then I also want to show how the economies of all these countries that have suffered the coups, unlike other African countries, are essentially very weak, dependent economies that are not endogenous, meaning they really don't fulfill the needs in terms of production of the demands of the citizens of African countries. And then finally, I would like to suggest that these series of coup d'etats that we are seeing are also acts of desperation by the militaries in these countries who are in competition with the political elite. So we have the political elite in Africa competing with the military elite. So it's a power struggle of the bourgeoisie, really, in Africa. And the masses, of course, bear the brunt of the suffering. But I would also like to suggest that there's something fundamentally very different that is now occurring in these countries and throughout Africa, actually. The youth are emerging, the youth are protesting, and essentially these coup d'etats, I see them as acts of desperation to prevent the youth in Africa from seizing power. Really, they're trying to preempt what I believe are the beginnings of possible popular revolutions in African countries. The state is weak, the state is exhausted, the state has been further weakened as a result of the COVID pandemic in African countries. So let me go methodically and expand a little bit about each one of these topics that I outline. The state essentially in most African countries, the state is a fiction. It is very fictitious. Power is concentrated in the rural areas, in the urban areas. These are the centers of powers where the political and the military elite reside. And then furthermore, power is concentrated in individuals, tyrants dictators or individuals who maintain their legitimacy through sham elections, individualized power. And that is why it is relatively very easy to seize power in these countries. Essentially, you get a hold of the person who is referred to as the prime minister or the president, and you get them to announce that they are resigning, or you, the military, announce on national radio or TV that you've seized power. And that's precisely what has happened in many African countries. It is precisely what happened in Mali in August 2020 when a United States-trained colonel, Assimi Goïta, seized power from President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. And then in Chad, earlier this year, in April, when the ruler of 30 years, military leader Idris Deby, was assassinated. After he was killed, the Constitution called for the Speaker of the Parliament to take over as president. But also in Chad, the military simply seized power, announced that it was in control, and installed Idris Deby's son, Mohamed Deby, as the new ruler. And this was supported, endorsed, and essentially carried out by France, which has forces in Chad, just as it has forces in Mali as well. And Emmanuel Macron rushed to Chad to anoint and coronate Mohamed Deby as the new puppet of France ruling Chad. So relatively very easy. And then once again in May, the same Assimi Goïta, who after seizing power in August 2020 in Mali, had maintained some fiction. He'd appointed a civilian president and a civilian prime minister, but essentially he retained the power as the vice president. So in May, he decided to do away with this fiction. He dismissed the civilian president, the civilian prime minister, and seized absolute power for himself, just by simply announcing on the national TV that he was now the president of Mali. And now this brings us to the coup d'etat in Guinea, where a colonel, Mamadi Doumbouya, who was once an officer in the French Foreign Legion, announced that he had seized power from President Alpha Condé, who is 83 years old, who, by the way, had manipulated and changed the Constitution last year to allow himself to run for a third term. So not many people are shedding any tears for Alpha Condé. So this is what is common amongst all these countries: the weakness of the state, the fictitious nature of the state, not in just these three countries that I'm focusing on, but essentially throughout Africa. And this, of course, is the best evidence, the indictment of the state, the need for power to be decentralized, to be spread throughout the countries to the grassroots, so that you really have administrative structures at the grassroots level where government is functioning and can actually function as a counterbalance against this tremendous vulnerability in each of these countries by virtue that power is concentrated in an individual. That is a major crisis in most African countries. So now let me talk about the second element that is also common among all these countries and throughout Africa: the weakness of the economies. When your main economic production is geared toward fulfilling the needs of the industrialized countries, you're exposed to a tremendous vulnerability. And that has been the case of African countries since during the colonial era, and then, of course, especially after the colonial era, when the structures of the economies never change. It is actually essentially the structure which was set up in 1884 at the Berlin Conference, when Africa was partitioned and divided amongst the European countries. They continue to be producers of primary commodities and exporting these commodities to the former colonial powers, which of course are now the industrialized powers in the West. And of course now they also have export relationships with China, which is the new industrial power as well. So they're very weak. Their production is not geared toward meeting the demands of their own citizens. So that is the number one weakness. And now that weakness has been compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic throughout Africa. In fact, this was something which was not difficult to predict. At the beginning of the pandemic, I produced a short video commentaries. I was interviewed in some cases, and I also wrote short editorials. And I said emphatically that many African countries, their governments rather, would not survive the ramification, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on their economies. Because you have economies that are weak, dependent on export to the West, and now you have restricted economic activity as a result of the lockdown. So now you're going to have less exports. You're going to have less tourists coming into these countries, no tourism at all, in fact. You're going to have diminished revenues, and you already have high unemployment, particularly of the young people, and they make up really the population in Africa. So when you say youth unemployment in Africa, you're actually talking about unemployment. So let me give you an example. In Uganda, 80% of the population is under the age of 35. That is the entire population. So if you say youth unemployment in Uganda is 80%, you're actually saying unemployment is 80%. And you have these high numbers, 60% plus in other African countries, South Africa, for example, among the youth. So now you have this explosive combustible situation, diminished economic production, economic activity, diminished revenue, the youth increasingly dissatisfied, unemployment increasing. So something will have to give. And that is why I predicted that many governments would not survive this pandemic. And I think we are now beginning to see the manifestation being played out in African countries. I do not think it's a coincidence that we're seeing the series of coup d'etats within a very short time frame in these African countries. And I expect that there will be more uprooting of governments in other African countries in the months ahead of us as this pandemic continues to wreak havoc on the economies of African countries. So I wanted to talk about the weakness of the state, but also about the weakness of the economies. And of course, they are tied in together simply because of the position that African countries, similar to other non-industrialized parts of the world, economies, and their dependent relationship with the industrialized countries. And that is a situation that can only be rectified and changed by political action. So you see the correlation between the economic weakness and the political weakness. They're interdependent and dependent. And now let me talk about, finally, what I believe is different in terms of what is happening in Africa right now, not only in terms of the consequences, the manifestation of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the destruction that it's wreaked on Africa's economies. Even before the pandemic, we had seen that young people are increasingly much more emboldened and protesting. And of course, it is not surprising. These unemployment numbers that I just elaborated are simply not sustainable. They're impossible, with or without the pandemic. At some point, something was going to start to give. I think the pandemic has just accelerated that situation. You have dependent economies not producing to fulfill the domestic needs. You have increasing unemployment. You have rapidly increasing populations. So it did not take any level of genius to understand that at some point we were going to start seeing upheavals in African countries. We're going to start seeing more of the youth coming out to protest. The protest of young people is what led to the change of government in the Sudan, when the dictator of 30 years, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, was overthrown by his own army, which of course was a preemptive strike by the military in the Sudan to preempt a popular revolution. And the solution they came up with was to have a transitional government in which both the military and the civilians are involved. And at the end of the day, I believe because of the pressure of the young people, ultimately the military will be forced to take a less dominant role. It is just inevitable, whether the military likes it or not. So that was the example in the Sudan. So now you see that in all these places where you've had the coups d'etat, there was an ongoing protest at that time. So that to me is the most critical underlying activity, underlying force that needs more analysis and more focus on. So rather than looking at the individuals who overthrew whom in whatever African country, that to me is not interesting to me in terms of analysis. You could switch the names. Today Mali, today Chad, today Guinea. I guarantee you tomorrow it's going to be another African country, because they all share this common condition: weak civilian governments that are not rooted in the grassroots, weak economies dependent on export of primary commodities to the industrialized countries and imports of manufacturers. So meaning that their economies are dependent on the demand in those industrial countries. And if the demand is disrupted by an intervention such as the COVID pandemic, you're going to have those consequences. High unemployment, a youth population that is increasingly emboldened. So all this toxicity exists in African countries. And it could take the form of a popular revolution. And I think those are the beginnings of what we were seeing. You know, when Assimi Goïta seized power in Mali in August 2020, there were popular protests going on. Students, trade unions, religious leaders had all come together, you know, and the civilian government, in fact, had been paralyzed, you see? And the military, which I see as part of the elite, as I said, the power struggle between the bourgeoisie and the military and in the civilian world, that is what happened. The military stepped in to preempt a revolution. And that has not disappeared. The conditions are still there. And I think when Assimi seized power once again this year in May, that to me was just an act of desperation. At the end of the day, he's going to have to address the demands of the youth, of the trade unions, and that is completely unavoidable. So his hold on power is fictitious. The same thing in Chad. In fact, Idris Deby was assassinated as a result of ongoing political power struggle within the political class and the military class. And this was a result of ongoing protests that had built up. Once again, young people in Chad were protesting and demonstrating in the streets. They want an end to the military regimes. So as a result of some power struggle within the elite, Idris Deby was assassinated and his son was imposed as the new puppet ruler of France. But the conditions, as was the case in Mali, still remained, the underlying conditions remain unresolved. The young people are still demanding to have a say in how the country is governed in order to address their demands, which of course is a lack of jobs and lack of playing any role in how the government is actually run. So I see this new dictator's hold on power in Chad as also extremely tenuous. And finally, in Guinea, once again, the same conditions. When Alpha Condé manipulated the constitution, immediately protests erupted. He went on to conduct elections and claimed that he won. The protests continued. In fact, which is pretty unusual, other neighboring African countries started to shun him because normally they have a herd mentality. They cover for each other. But perhaps these other African countries saw the level of discontent and dissension within Guinea itself, and that is why they had started to shun President Alpha Condé. So obviously the coup d'etat was not surprising. And so that's the common theme that ties all these countries that I've elaborated on, but they also, as I indicated, affect all the other African countries who are subjected to those same political and economic conditions as well. So what does this mean? This to me actually suggests that there's a possibility for fundamental change in Africa. And when I say that, what do I mean? It means that we can arrive at a situation where government, a new government, actually addresses the needs of the citizens of African countries. And the best example was, of course, the revolutionary coup d'etat by Thomas Sankara in what was then Upper Volta in 1983, when he seized power, and he showed that political power, properly exercised, can actually fundamentally transform the lives of Africans. Within the short years from 1983 to 1987 he was in power, just a mere 4 years, he accomplished, he had remarkable achievements. He made Burkina Faso, first of all, he changed the name of the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of the upright, so that people felt a sense of pride in being citizens of that African country. And then he mobilized the population to really take agency over their lives. They became food self-sufficient within 3 years, within his lifetime, right? No need to import food from overseas, particularly from France. He created industries that had existed before the colonial regime, and he simply revived them. And for example, he promoted the production of cotton and the production of textiles and tailoring of clothes, so that there was no need to import clothes from overseas. He mobilized the population to build rural clinics, to build schools, to plant millions of trees, to stop desertification in his country. We're talking in the 1980s, when even in most of the Western countries, issues of environment was still being shunned. He empowered women because he said this sizable bulk of the population, by being marginalized, it means we're underutilizing our natural resources, our women. So he empowered them by giving them meaningful positions, not token jobs. And he recruited them in the armed forces and gave them real positions in the military as well. And that, of course, changed the psychology of women in Burkina Faso. It reduced the level of male domination and abuse of women, because now when you teach them military skills, it obviously expands their consciousness and their feelings about themselves in Burkina Faso and in life and in Africa. And of course, Sankara touched the third rail when he proposed that African countries renounce the debt, the billions of dollars in debt collectively. And that was the meeting of the Organization of African Unity in July 1987. And he said, if I do it alone, they will assassinate me. Let's do it collectively. They can't kill all of us. And unfortunately, he was not supported by the other African countries. And his prediction came true. He was killed within 3 months in October by his second in command, Blaise Compaoré, under the influence of the French, of course. So will we see more Thomas Sankaras in Africa? It's possible. I'm still skeptical about the coup in Guinea. This Colonel Mamadi has said this is not a coup d'etat. This is a people's uprising. I'm very skeptical. I wait to see. Hopefully he will shock me, and he will give us the possibility of the kind of government that Sankara produced in Burkina Faso, because that essentially is what we need in Africa. And we saw a recent change in government in Zambia when the president Lungu lost to his political rival. He was voted out of office so overwhelmingly that he had to accept the results. And this was because the youth came out in mass numbers in Africa, in Zambia. So that is essentially what is going on. There's something very different right now. The youth in Africa, I think they've really had enough, and that is what distinguishes these recent coups from previous coups d'etats in African countries. So that is what I wanted to focus on today, to go beyond just looking at Guinea in isolation, but to see Guinea in a thematic sense that gives us a broader understanding, and to see Guinea, Chad and Mali, and even the Sudan as suggesting possibilities, hopeful possibilities going forward for Africa, not because of anything to do with the military or the political class, but because the youth are really demanding the change in Africa. Thank you. I thank all new patrons as well. Remain Pan-African, remain healthy, and see you all soon.